I'm Zeb Elif, Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College and Hebrew Theological College, and I'm joined by Professor Beth Wenger, the Moritz and Josephine Berg Professor of History, Associate for Graduate Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, someone who is formative in the field of American Jewish history. And for this Why's That segment, I've asked Beth to travel back in time to about a decade or so ago, when she published a really important book, History Lessons, with Princeton University Press, which negotiates the tensions of scholarly history and heritage and memory, and when do the two clash, when do the two blend, and what to make of these materials. So thank you so much, Professor Wenger, for joining.
Thank you.
So when we speak about heritage, how do historians, how do students of history make sense of this material? And how do you define heritage for American Jews?
So let me take apart the pieces of that question a little bit. I think at the beginning, especially scholars like David Lowenthal, who's written about heritage versus history, I'm not sure everyone agrees with that versus part anymore, but let's just get our terms on the table. So heritage is really the way that groups of people tell themselves who they are. You know, what do we belong to? Where did we come from? And in America, what's our role here? So there's a kind of collective nature to it, but the point about it is that it's always a partisan effort, right? It's designed to protect and to generate group interests, which for some scholars like Lowenthal separates it completely from the academic discipline of history, which is purported to be objective and relying on facts and evidence and all the rules that we as historians consider crucial to our enterprise. I myself think the lines are sometimes a little blurred, not always blurred. I mean, listen, we're historians, you and I. We make a lot of what's supported by evidence and what's not, and that's always going to be necessary to our discipline. But the fact is that we can't help but admit that what's going on in our own times influences, at least to some extent, what we choose to research and what drives our thinking. So that's where I say that there is a murky line, although there's a line. And the heritage, to get to the second part of your question, you know, I think that all scholars of memory and heritage talk about the fact that it's a reconstruction, not a faithful recording of events that goes on for all peoples, everywhere, in every society, in every place and time. And historians, a term I'm using loosely here, or groups of people always have the needs of the present in mind when they're reconstructing that past. And that's how I made the distinction in this work.
So some of your work, the nostalgia of immigrant life on the Lower East Side might be part of that murkier substance. The assumptions that Columbus was a Jew, yes, probably beyond the pale of acceptable historical analysis. Why?
Yes. However, so you bring up this business book of Columbus being a Jew, which was, let's unpack why what became something of importance to Jews to tell that story. Let's just get it out on tape here. It's not true. But that positions Jews at the beginning of North America, although not really, but the stories that are, because we know that there were indigenous peoples long before Columbus, which is a whole other story. But, you know, in the stories at the time that this became popular in the late 19th century, this myth, it connects Jews with the so-called founding moments of the nation. And that was always a key component of not only American Jewish heritage, but of almost every ethnic, racial, religious group's heritage in the United States. We were there from the beginning, and making Columbus a Jew obviously affects that. And the reason I pushed back immediately when you said, well, that's not a subject of legitimate history, but in fact, it was one of the first undertakings of the American Jewish Historical Society, founded in 1892. One of its first studies sponsored by the society, the American Jewish Historical Society, was to investigate this claim by a very serious scholar, Mayor Kaiserly. And of course, he found that he was not, but in fact, that likely conversos made the trip with him, which isn't too surprising.
Is the impulse, and obviously we could pile it on here, the Indians, Native Americans being the 10 lost tribes, your wonderful chapter on Chaim Solomon and the enlarged import of his role in the American Revolution are all attempts to fasten Jews into not just the wider American historical memory, but to anchor them in the foundational myth.
Yes, and that is crucial, right? And not unique to Jews, I want to point out, right? Look at Crispus Attucks, and I could name you a litany of other ethnic and religious and racial heroes. So it's a desire to be there at the beginning, to be there at the moment of the founding. I just want to say Chaim Solomon is a little bit of a different story than Columbus, right? Columbus, that was entirely mythical, that he was a Jew. Chaim Solomon was a living, breathing, real person.
Was Jewish.
Was Jewish, from Poland, actually, in that moment, but and contributed to the revolutionary cause in very important ways, but ways that became embellished beyond what the fact would say. So again, there are gradations of this.
Right, there is the elaboration, the embellishment, but all of them contribute to something that's really hard to really get, I guess, your finger on it, which is the impulse to be a part of the wider American experience and the culture.
Yes. So I want to return to the sources if we can at the end. But what I want to say about the impulse is I think it comes from two places that might seem contradictory, but I think actually are wedded. One is a kind of fear of not belonging. Fear for Jews, it was anti-Semitism. For other groups, it was that they weren't a part of that white Christian majority and had to really highlight their stories for fear of not belonging. The other side of that coin is aspirational, that we want to belong, we are a part, and telling these stories helps us be more a part. I think these are actually very much connected, but come from, if you will, hope and fear at the same time. Although the fear part is hardly ever voiced. It sort of lurks behind some of these. Why are we trying to show how much we are patriots? It's because there's a fear. And this is especially in the case of Jews, you could see it around military service. And this lingers from Europe, the notion that Jews don't properly serve in battle. And so there are not only children's stories that talk about Jews in service, but there are, again, early histories that literally count Jews and have their names of those who served as a way of proving just how patriotic Jews are. But of course, this comes from a little bit of an undercurrent. Sure. And in the case of, probably know I'm referring to Simon Wolf's book, early book that chronicled Jews as patriots and soldiers. It was very much a reaction to a publication that claimed that Jews did not serve.
And so in many ways, the argument is that the cultivation of these stories and the embellishment of these stories, obvious, I think how we began with, it's not necessarily verses all the time, but it's a matter of what should the historian do to understand these sources? And the answer is, well, the stories teach us much, not necessarily about the substance of the story, but much about the people who recounted them. Absolutely. And what they felt their needs in that moment were. And I'll say two things about that. We've been talking very generally about these sources. The kinds of things, as you know, that I looked at were children's stories, sort of sermons by rabbis, public celebration, in some cases monument building. These things where historians are not always involved. And many historians say, that's the stuff of, it's self-congratulatory, which it is, it's grandiose. That's not our material. What I wanted to say is, what if I make that my source material and look at it as a product, not necessarily as traditional academic history, which it never purported to be, but as a source that helps us understand what Jews, in my case, were looking for in forming a collective history, how they formed it, what pieces they put in. And by the way, it wasn't one collective history. As I point out, if you look at socialists and radicals, they have a different history than, for example, Reform rabbis. They have some similarities, but the second thing I want to say is that Jews and many other ethnic and religious minorities, if we're talking about the late 19th and early 20th centuries, seldom found their experiences reflected in formal histories of the United States.
There was no American Jewish history as an academic discipline in this time. It did not exist as a field. The field is relatively young, as are many other ethnic and racial and religious histories. Right. So many of these groups cobbled together their own amateur histories from, you know, a smattering of professional works and a lot of amateurs that created a kind of collective past that wouldn't pass muster as an academic discipline, but was what they had.
Right, right. And so they weren't competing with anything else at the same time. And it's interesting, the confluence of our field and the production of what we would eventually call American Jewish history teaches us much about the content of what they were studying, but also the people who produced them in the first place.
I'll say the most fundamental of all these myths that almost all groups share to some extent is this notion that American Judaism has a perfect symbiosis with American democracy. This is, of course, not based in any fact, right? American Judaism, the Bible, it's a theocracy, it's not a democracy. But this became something that we very much have to see that Jews constructed. It is not, it's something I write at the beginning of the book that I heard my own students tell me.
Right.
As fact, which shows how well and successfully it was constructed. But sometimes what we need to do is deconstruct it and think about the fact that Jews actually built this idea. Right. And they had reasons for it, as I explained, but it's worth academics thinking about how and why and with what tools and narratives they built that.
Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.